Have you ever been on a road trip or just in the street for some other reason and noticed the amount of utility poles that seem to stretch infinitely? No matter where you go in the US, these poles stand tall and strong, stringing together the very cables that bring us electricity and communication. How on earth are there so many? This is analysis. You can call me Analyst or Ann, and this is how utility poles were laid out in America. The story of the utility pole takes us all the way back to the 1840s. The reason we're going back so far is because originally, utility poles weren't as stacked as they are now. Nowadays, we see like all this electricity, telephone wires and stuff. You know, some of them power street lights. Back then, when they were just invented, it was just like 2 weak telegraph wires on those poles. Most of what we call utility poles nowadays were originally telegraph poles set up by telegraph companies. And then later down the road, people were like, telephone? Electricity? Okay. And they just like looked up for probably 5 seconds and realized we have a million poles already that we could put those on. But to truly understand the origin of the utility pole, we're going to go all the way back to its original purpose, which was the telegraph. I'm not going to go too in depth on like how they made the telegraph. I'm just going to focus on the wood. In the year 1844, Samuel Morse, along with his colleagues, pitched the single-wire telegraph system to Congress and secured $30,000 in funding. This funding was for an experimental line set to be built between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore along the path of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. I don't know how Ohio snuck in there, but that's what it is. It's the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. This experimental line, what it would do is it would basically connect Washington, D.C. and Baltimore to show what the technology could do for the country. At first, the idea was to route the cables underground, but that proved inefficient, so Morse proposed an idea to string the cables on wooden poles so they're suspended over the air. They tried this idea, working at it for months, and it worked. This was the birth of the utility pole. Well, actually, it was like 700 utility poles, but this is the birth of it. After successfully demonstrating the potential for the telegraph system, Morse and his team needed to expand the telegraph pole ecosystem. The question arose, how are they going to go from one route with 700 poles to several routes with many thousands of poles transporting telegraph lines all across the country? It was actually through private funding. Initially, Morse and his crew sought to sell the patent for the telegraph system to the government so they could leave the potential of the technology in their hands. When they went to sell it to the government was like, we think it's pretty cool, and you know, we give you a little to build the experimental line, but that's all you. And then Morse came back a second time, a while later. He actually provided some really good points as to why the government should be in control, and they were like, no. But after being declined the first time, the crew reluctantly decided to shoot for help from private capital. But only if the contract still allowed them to sell it to the government. They really wanted the government to do this. At first, a promoter from Philadelphia showed interest, but lost it when he heard about the clause in the contract that reserved the rights. Another promoter, David Burbank, was also seeking funding for the telegraph system and proposed, along with a friend of his name was Smith, to buy the patent, which went nowhere because Vail, one of Morse's partners, was very stingy about his shares of the patent because he believed the government should still have control over the telegraph system. Regardless, Smith, Burbank's partner, hired a man named Ezra to go to Boston to promote the telegraph system. What Ezra basically did, like 5-minute crafts, he just took a telegraph wire, hung them across 2 streets over the city hall, and he did all that just for the people of Boston to not care. Then they brought the showcase to New York, who at first didn't even want to hear about it because they believed the wires would attract lightning. But eventually, they paid a scientist $50 to vouch for them and basically go out and say, actually, the wires will not attract lightning. And then after all of that, they set up the showcase, and again, nobody showed up. Another big city, yet again, shows disinterest in the wonders of the telegraph system. But while all this promotion was going on, many investors who were actually interested provided the financial support that Morse and Vail needed. And like that, the Magnetic Telegraph Company was born, and the money was raised to start expanding the lines.
I will love you always.
Now that they had enough funding to expand the telegraph system, Morse and Vail needed a plan. Eventually, a man named Kendall came along. He met Morse right before Morse consulted the government a second time and told him he wanted to talk to him about the telegraph system if he fails to impress Congress. I'm sure you can guess what happened in there, so Morse was like, okay, come on board and be the agent for 3/4 of my patent right. The thing about Kendall is he was actually super qualified for this. This guy used to be a journalist and a member of the cabinet, which is a really high position in the executive branch of the government. You may be wondering, Kendall became the agent for 3/4 of the patent right? So where did the other fourth go? It went to Smith. Kendall was familiar with the most economic routes in the country, so he sent these along to Morse and proposed that they build lines along the routes, then branched out from those routes and spread across the country. So, linemen hired by the Magnetic Telegraph Company started moving mountains, all hands on deck, burning the midnight oil, whatever. The point is, the Magnetic Telegraph Company is responsible for the initial expansion of the telegraph system. And so, the utility poles, they started putting down a bunch of the original utility poles. Other potential investors saw this, and they were all like, yo boss, are you seeing this shit? So then, more companies were created for the telegraph industry, one of which was actually Western Union. Yes, the bank Western Union, which originally started out as the New York Mississippi Printing Telegraph Company, and later, after some mergers and stuff, shortened down to the much nicer Western Union Telegraph Company. Can you guess who co-founded Western Union? Correct! Ezra from earlier. Western Union was responsible for the first transcontinental telegraph pole route, but we're gonna stay in the US for this one. Anyways, more telegraph companies cropped up, and the workforce multiplied. But we're not done yet. These are just telegraph poles. They didn't have all of the extra utilities that we have in modern day utility poles. Surely it would be a lot of work to string a whole bunch of new stuff, even onto pre-existing wooden poles. How do they do it? Enter the early 20th century. Both the telephone and electricity were booming. People wanted them in their homes, businesses, telephones were on the street, electricity was in cars. It was huge.
Hey Edison, how about sharing some of those light bulbs, huh?
One problem arose. In order to transfer electricity, both for utility and telephone use, from point A to B, we needed to string a wire. Engineers looked at this and realized we already have wooden poles that hold wires that are important to our infrastructure. So the rational decision was to go with this. However, you can't just drape a wire on a telegraph pole and call it a day. If you're for some reason asking why, this is what happens when electrical companies don't follow regulations when they set up utility poles. This is the 2007 Malibu Canyon fire, also known as the Corral fire. I'm not sure if any fatalities were reported during this disaster, but since it was a genuine catastrophe that destroyed people's homes and injured some firefighters, I'm going to be straightforward about this section. This fire burned for 3 days, from the 24th of November to the 27th, and burned almost 5,000 acres of land, while also forcing almost 15,000 residents to evacuate. This fire was reportedly ignited when 3 utility poles were downed into vegetation by strong winds. These utility poles were found to not be in compliance with General Order 95, the overhead electric line construction regulations for California. This fire, tragic and unfortunate, demonstrates the importance of regulations when it comes to things like this. It's safe to say the regulations are needed when it comes to stringing electrical wires on telegraph poles. Returning to the 20th century. Back when it was time for companies to start using telegraph poles for more than just the telegraph system, regulations were taken into very careful consideration. The Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or the IEEE, set appropriate standards for things like insulation and protection from lightning strikes, along with measures for keeping poles sturdy and keeping vegetation from growing around them. With these regulations, electrical companies and telephone companies, they started going ham, like there was money to be made here. So within a few decades, major cities had set up what we now recognize as modern utility poles. Nowadays, we see these things everywhere. Some people may disregard them, others may gaze at the beauty of them as they stand tall and proud, stringing together our infrastructure. I hope this video was educational to you on how the utility pole came to fruition and multiplied across the US, or in the very least, entertaining. This has been Analysis, and this week we analyzed how utility poles were laid across America.